Okay, so welcome everyone and welcome with Yangsze, and we're so happy to have you. It's a very enthusiastic crowd you have. So thank you very much for making the time to come and talk to us.
Oh, it's my pleasure, Shirin, and thank you for having me. And hello, everyone. Thanks for stopping in this evening.
Yeah, it's a great crowd. It's an unusual crowd, not only just unusually big, but as you can see, we have like whole Eric Sederboom's little square there. He's got his whole writing group attending with him as well. So we're like groups on top of groups. And I've been doing this for, I, I can't even remember how long I've been doing this now, to be honest with you, but it's been years. But for the very first time, everyone, in all of these interviews, my mom has decided to attend. So I would take that as a huge compliment. Hi, Mom. Um, okay, so Yangsze, your three books, which I've read and I absolutely loved, and so a little bit about me. I'm also Malaysian Chinese. At least my dad was. My mom came from mainland China, um, and it was just so refreshing to find these books that actually set in Malaysia. I hadn't actually encountered anything in like kind of common American popular culture that was actually set in Malaysia before. So congratulations. And did it make you hesitate at all to set your books, in Malaysia, which a lot of people really have no concept of where Malaysia is or what it is really. So did that make
Well,
you hesitate?
I thought about it, but to be very honest with you, I just never thought I would be published. I was writing very much for myself, as I'm sure many of you do. And I do feel that, when most humans want to create, the act of creating something, whether it's writing a novel or a journal or a poem a day or fixing your bike or knitting. It is creating something. It is an innate desire in humans. And most of us would, cross stitch the Eiffel Tower if no one was going to look at it. So that's how I felt about writing. It was really very much, a hobby of mine. Or shall I say, something that was dear to my heart. And so when I was writing, I wrote about what I felt I knew about or that I felt I had a story about. And as I mentioned, I just didn't think I would ever get published. I just thought nobody is going to read this book, which is set in a small town about an obscure practice of spirit marriages in a small Southeast Asian country. And in some ways, it was enormously freeing. I just wrote for what I thought was interesting. Later on, when I found out that it was actually going to be published, I thought, oh dear, I better make sure I got everything right. Otherwise, my friends and family in Malaysia will just kill me. So I didn't do. I had to go back and double check that I got all the names right, and what was the right currency for that time. But that is no different from any other historical fiction. I do
Mhm,
think that historical fiction, particularly, is a genre in which it is good to be accurate because
mhm,
all
mhm.
novels, all of reading a novel is like entering a dream, somebody else's dream. And if something happens, you're like, no, 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 nobody had bicycles in 1678. The bicycle had the two-wheel had, but you're like, that's the end of the story. You're like, I fell out of my dream. I can't get over the bicycles.
Right.
So that's really important. Um,
So to stop me here, because you're kind of like making so many questions bounce in my mind. So first of all, I applaud the fact that you were writing just for the love of writing. Did that start very young? Like, is this something that you've just done all your life? You love to write?
well, I always like to write about things. I think in school we did a lot more writing. My children in the American school system was like, why are you not writing? They're like, no, no, we don't write things like this. So it might just have been a different school system,
Yeah.
in which they encourage you to write more. But I didn't actually start off writing stories. I actually wanted to draw. So I drew a lot of really terrible comic strips starring animals. And I wasn't very good artist. People were like, is that a dog or a mouse? And I was like, it's a cat. So my earliest forays were actually little comic strips,
Right.
animals doing things.
Uh-huh. And also, you chose to start in Malaysia as something that you knew, but you actually were born in the Philippines, I believe. Is that correct?
That's right. So my
And then
dad,
you,
oh, go on.
oh, it's no, you're about to tell, so please do so. So where did the wanderings take you, and how long did you stay in each place? And
Well, my dad worked for the Foreign Service, so he was always being sent to different places. And I spent a lot of my childhood in Germany and also in Japan. But in between, we came back to Malaysia, and my grandparents lived in a small town very close to Ipoh, which, if any of you have read Night, that's where it's set. I also had an uncle who lived in Malacca, and we always used to go and visit him. For those of you who are familiar with Malacca, you can wave hand. But I always thought it was a very ghostly town. So as a child visiting it, it is a strange old town which has been occupied by a succession of different people, like I think the Portuguese, the Dutch, the British, and it's full of old relics, including the grave that St. Francis Xavier was interred in for a while, and then they dug him up again to send him to Goa. And so you can walk up the hill and you can see basically an open grave. So in my mind, Malacca was this strange, mystical town, which is a little bit creepy. So when I was writing my first novel, The Ghost Bride, it felt very natural to set it there.
Mhm. I'm going to just jump a little from your first book to your last. So the Foxwife is set in Manchuria, right? So
Mhm.
where was the familiarity with Manchuria, which is quite a shift? Your first two books, like very like deliciously kind of Malaysian. Like for someone who actually is in the know, it was such a pleasure to pick up all those little details that you, as you said, you got right, and that there was like this. So I believe at one point you mentioned Kue Lapis, which is like my favorite cake on the planet. I was like, oh my God, Kue Lapis, so it was really fun that way. But then I was really surprised at this big and equally convincing shift to Manchuria. So where did Manchuria come from?
Well, I wanted to write about foxes.
Mm.
So growing up, I had read a lot of stories which were written down by this guy called Pu Songling. And Pu Songling was a failed scholar. He never did well in the imperial exams. What he's famous for is compiling a book, 500 stories. Um, Basically is like the twilight zone of 17th century China. And they were all very like curiosities written down as histories, like in such and such a town, the following strange thing happened. So I was very, very taken with this when I was young. And I wanted to write about foxes. So those of you who might be familiar with East Asian literature probably know that the fox is a shapeshifter in Chinese, Japanese, and Korean literature. And so I thought I really want to write about foxes. And then we run into the whole like we must be historically accurate. So initially I was like, shall I write about a fox that gets on a boat and goes to Malaysia? And I thought, well, okay, that's really like, let's shoehorn this. And so I thought, no, let us see the home of the fox, which is northern China. And I've always found Manchuria interesting, partly because of the South Manchurian Railway. So I'm very fond of railways. As those of you who read The Night Tiger might know, like, oh, there's a lot of trains in this book. So I was very interested in that. And the other thing is that, so I spent part of my childhood in Japan, and my mother-in-law is actually from the north. She's from Shandong. So I did a ton of research about that. And I also, looked at basically historical photographs, read people's memoirs. And one of the very nicest things that happened when I was on book tour is that a lady from, I think, Dongbei, she came to one of my events and she asked me if I came from Dongbei. And I was like, no, I'm Malaysian. But she said the descriptions I mean, it was very nice of her to say that, but she said it really felt like she was there. So, and I did
That's
visit China
lovely.
as well when I was doing
So you
research.
actually, so you spent some time on the in the grasslands, as you say.
I did not get to the grasslands because of COVID. So,
Oh
um,
no!
but I did go to Suzhou, Hangzhou, and to see the garden villas of the literati, which is super interesting. So it shows up in The Foxwife, these amazing mansions, like worlds within created worlds, which is very much a mainstay of Chinese literature. And I think in its modern incarnation is the Asian soap opera, like all these things happen in this wealthy family who live in this giant mansion. And so that's what it is like. It is a world that is constricted because the women were not permitted to leave the house most of the time.
Right.
So
Right.
it was really interesting. I went to look at all these gardens, many of which, hundreds of years old. I think Hangzhou used to have 100 garden villas or more, some of which were purported to be 1,000 years old.
Mhm.
Not all of
Okay,
them
so
had
this
survived.
brings up this question for me because it's very obvious that you love history and you don't you might not know about me, but that I'm actually a total history nerd, and I'm actually working on this historical fiction that's taken me so long that it's history in its own right. It's taken so long. So, but you obviously love history, but in every book though there is a mystery, and in every book there is a romance. So my question is, like, when you sit down to write it, like, what came first? Like, was it the historical, were you like, oh, I'm writing historical fiction, but I'm going to put a mystery in it, and you know and then the characters fall in love of their own accord or whatever? But or do you sit down and think, I'm going to write a mystery and I'm going to put it in this really interesting historical wrapper? Like, which way does it work for you?
Well, that's an interesting question. And the terrible truth is that I do not plan and I have no outline. And, so my husband always says, if you only had an outline, there'd be a lot less of this howling and rolling on the floor. But that's a great question. I think I begin with the setting. So all the
Mm,
stories have begun with the first chapter of each book is very much, which I have written down very much as you, the reader, can read it. So for The Ghost Bride, I had a picture in my mind of this oil lamp flickering and this girl at night saying, my father has asked me to become a ghost bride. And it is the sense of the room, the time, the feeling, the humidity, the heat, um, and perhaps how suffocating it can feel on hot nights in Malaysia and also filled with dread. My grandmother used to tell us like very scary ghost stories. Blackouts in Malaysia, which Shirin, you might know about. So, so the setting is what began it. And for Night Tiger, again, it was the setting, the 1930s colonial Malaya that I thought was really interesting. For Foxwife, it was the foxes. So it's kind of maybe a biggish area, but a feeling. There is a feeling of curiosity, like I want to know more. And then the story begins from there. Um, the number of
mhm.
murders in each book, I am afraid, is due to the fact that I grew up on a steady diet of Agatha Christie. And I always want to write a mystery. And at one point, actually, for Night Tiger, my editor said, an awful lot of people died in this book. And it's like, well, and I thought, well, for Agatha Christie, like, shouldn't there be at least 10? So I think we're okay. So, but I've always wanted to write a murder mystery. So that often happens. Romance, I'm actually rather bad at. So I'm being
Oh, well,
very
I think
honest
that you
with
have
you.
fans that would disagree. I think that you have fans that would disagree. If you can make someone fall in love with a dragon, I think you're doing well.
Oh, that
Anyway,
wasn't planned.
you mentioned oh, I'm going to come back to that because that was just
Mm,
interesting. But before I lose the thought, you mentioned your editor, and I realized that we have jumped all the way from you loved writing even as a child to you now have an editor, and in between I was just writing because I like to write. At some point, though, you sent something in an envelope or through an email to someone. So how did you get to that point? Like,
mhm.
at what point did you go, okay, everything that was written for myself, but I'm now going to see how it does out in the world out there?
What happened was my husband, and I don't know whether I should tell the story because it simply encourages him. But what happened was I was actually just writing, and I was writing for myself, and I'd written actually, I spent 8 years, Shirin, on a terrible first novel about an elephant detective, and that didn't go anywhere. So I was writing The Ghost Bride, and we were having dinner with some friends, and they very kindly asked, "Hey, I know you've been writing something. How's it going? Can we read it?" And I said, "Sure," with no intention that I would ever send it to anyone. And after we came home, my husband went to my computer and then emailed out my unfinished novel to our friends. I see some of you are shaking your heads. Yes, that was my reaction. In fact, I was like, "What are you doing?" And he said, "But you said it was okay. You said they wanted to read it. So I just thought I would help you." And it's like, how could you do this? But so I mean, that was like, I think the equivalent of a big kick in the pants, because what happened was our friends even more kindly actually looked at it. Um, and they were like, "Oh, this is actually kind of entertaining. And why don't you submit this?" And at that point, I was like, okay, fine. I felt encouraged, um, because I think there's a lot of us just writing and stashing things in a drawer or on your computer. And okay, fine. Some people said that they might, and that's how actually it happened. I I then Googled, how do you get published? And I also asked a friend of mine who was an aspiring YA writer at the time, and she'd said, "Hey, you should send a letter out." And so, which is very much basically Google will tell you the same thing. You need to put together a one-page letter together with 10 pages of your manuscript and send it out. It is very daunting and at the same time, weirdly straightforward. And it is also good for those of us who are shy. You don't have to go and talk to anyone, you just have to submit your work. So that's what happened with me. I submitted it. I submitted to a handful of agents, and then I heard back from them, and eventually it got published. But it is a very strange business.
So, about the strangeness of the business. How did you said it eventually got published. Was it the first submission that got published then? It was the elephant book? Was that what your husband sent?
No,
Or was
no.
it it was the unfinished Ghost Bride that got
Ghost
sent?
Bride. So it's like
Okay.
the elephant detective should not come to light. But I had written the Ghost Bride, and actually I mean, some time elapsed because I realized I had to finish a book. So for those of you who are writing fiction, they want the whole manuscript now. You cannot, nonfiction can be submitted on spec. You could say, "I am a dolphin expert and I'm writing a book about dolphins." So you could sell a book like that. But fiction, especially for a new author, they really want to see the whole manuscript. So I finished up my book and I sent it out. And I did some research. Nowadays you can find like lots and lots of stuff online about which agents might be interested. Look for, I think they call it comps. So find a book that you think is kind of like your book, and then look and see who represented them. And so that's what I did. I sent out a few to some agents, and when you start to hear back, then you realize, oh, someone might be interested in this. And then when someone starts to read it, I'm sure all of you probably know about this, then you should tell everyone else who's reading your novel that someone's made an offer on the book. And so that's how it goes. But I think there are many online resources. The only thing I would say too is, in some ways, I'm glad I did not know too much about the online resources, because later on, um, when you if you look through some of the forums, it just seems very daunting. It feels like this is just too hard. I just didn't know very much about it. In some ways, um, I think you should just try, because I came out of the slush pile, and many, many authors I know all came out of the slush pile. You do not need to know anybody. You don't need to have any connections. Um, in fact, I think my agent wrote some blog posts saying, you really don't need to know anyone. It was about me. So like I had this author, yeah, but really, actually, and I think about it, pretty much everyone I know came out of the slush pile. So
Uh-huh.
it happens.
So and you're with Jenny Bent, right? Is that
That's right.
correct?
Hmm.
And so it must have been kind of like, oh, well, I don't know very much about this. All of a sudden I'm getting offers. It sounds like you got multiple offers from various agents. How did you decide who to go with and and it's now been like a long partnership
Hmm.
over the course of a few books. So how did you find settling into that relationship? Because that's a very kind of unique relationship in the business, and it is a strange business. So
Hmm.
what was
I
that like?
think
Do you remember?
it depends on your novel and it depends on you. So, for example, you know, you had actually touched on that earlier when you said there's historical fiction, there's mystery, there's some romance, and so my books, and it depends on what you are writing. My books tended to cross genres, which I did not realize was not a necessarily a good thing, because booksellers prefer to know like where does this book go in my shop. So one of the things that I'm very grateful for, that I was lucky enough to talk to a few different agents, was I got to hear about how they see your book. So it's the same novel, but different people want to sell it in a different way. It's sort of like real estate. So they'll be like, I have a charming 2-bedroom cottage, and then somebody else is like, I have a haunted cabin clinging to the side of a mountain. And it's the same property, it's just the way that it's pitched. So for Ghost Bride, for example, I did talk to agents. Some agents were like, this is historical fiction. Others said, you know what? I think this is fantasy and we should try to sell it to Tor. And there were other people who I actually got some comments back from a rather well famous agent who'd said, I like your book. I just don't like all the dead people in it. So I'd like you to rewrite it without them. And I actually did think like, oh, if nobody else likes it, then I will try. I'll give it a shot and see. It'll be a different kind of book. So I ended up with Jenny because I asked her like, where do you think this book goes? And she said, to me, it is general fiction. It's just fiction. And
Hmm.
I think when you are looking for an agent, hopefully you should try to find someone whose vision for your book lines up with yours. So, and if you're lucky enough to talk to them, I think that's great. So
Hmm.
I am very grateful for that experience.
So when you sold that first book, it was a multiple book deal or just a single book deal?
Just the one.
And was there pressure then? Because that was so successful so quickly. Did you feel pressure to, you know, I mean, you said the elephant book took you 8 years, so I don't know how long the Ghost Bride took you, but was it all of a sudden, oh, I need a new property, within 18 months? Because I know from having once been a publisher myself, that's
Mm.
often the impetus, right? Like this is going strong. We need another one before that market disappears. Did you experience that? Like any
Mm.
pressure
Mhm.
or and part two of the question, did you already have these books in different forms? Like maybe even was starting to draft them. Like where were you with these books? Were they ideas? Were they nothing? Were they drafts?
Well, um, I must confess that I didn't have anything. So, and I also told Jenny, I did not actually feel from it. They will always ask you, do you have anything else in the works? And I did, before I finished all the edits for Ghost Bride, I did have the first chapter of Night Tiger, which is a scene in which an old man is dying and he asks his child servant to do something for him. Very gruesome and sad. But I had nothing else. And so I just mumbled something, like, I'm thinking about doing something in the 1930s. And they're like, okay, fine. And then they sort of left me alone. It is also to your own, you are absolutely right. They love 18 months. And some genres, if they allow you to write sequels or trilogies, and that tends to be more like young adult or mysteries, or it's a lot easier because you don't have to build the world again. But in my case, they're like, no, you can't write a sequel because I've been like, I could write a sequel. And they're like, no, come up with another one. And it took me, I think The Ghost Bride took me about 4 or 5 years. And Night Tiger took me 4 years. And The Fox Wife maybe took me 3.5 and almost four. So I'm a very slow writer. And that is actually just on me. So if I could write faster, maybe it'd be better. But it is very hard for me to write because I have no plan. So um, I have to write as the story comes. Some people are able to write faster, and perhaps it is
Mhm.
better for them. It is great
Mhm.
if you can promise someone a book every year and a half or 2 years. But in my case, unfortunately, I'm just a slow writer. Um, and everybody's agent is different, but Jenny was really lovely. Although somewhere in 2 years after, she's like, "How's your second book going?" I was like,
Well, um, I, I'm so enchanted by this conversation. I am keeping an eye on the clock though, because I know that you might have to jump off in short time, and I want to make sure everybody gets to ask their questions. There are a couple of things though that particularly intrigue me, and because I have the mic, I'm going to play my advantage and ask them. I was really, really fascinated by the way you use points of views and tenses, right? So you take a look in your first book, Lilan, it's all written first person, past tense, and then a very surprising change to the present tense right on page 382 for your kind of final chapter. So we'll just put a pin in that for the moment. Then second book, now you have 3 points of view. You have Ren, who, by the way, one of my favorite characters of all time. So Ren, very close third in present. Jilin, first tense, but in past. And then William, which is a distant third, a more distant third in present. And then the third book, you have now got two protagonists, which I think get an equal weighting. And Snow is first person past tense, and then Bao is third person present tense. So now I know you don't have an outline, you don't plan very much. Do all the points of views and all the shifts and tenses, do those come like instinctively, or like something tells you that you need to shift this into first to kind of like really highlight that this is the moment where she's making a decision? Does it all come instinctually, or is it part of the editing process? So do you have an editor that says, hey, you should shift this? Like, how does this come on? This is very unusual to like be playing with points of views and tenses quite so much.
mm, no, it doesn't happen. I'm sorry,
It just
but there's no
happens.
see. It is a feeling. I think the thing that is closest that I can describe that writing feels like to me, and perhaps to you, is that it feels like it's listening to music. I'm listening to the music of the story. And so that's why I sometimes feel like boom, boom, boom. Oh no, something bad's going to happen. I don't know what it is, but something bad is going to happen. So that's, the change in tempo. I think I would actually say that for Night Tiger and the Foxwife, there are actually only 2 points of view. So one is the first person, past, and the second one is third person, present. It's just that with Night Tiger, sometimes within the same chapter, you get Ren and you also get William. So that was how I organized it in my head. Um, and I
Hmm.
also
Hmm.
thought it would be easier to, so that because, and I didn't set out to do it, it just felt like this felt right. Sorry. But I also realize it is a useful indicator for the reader so that you know when you open the page of the book or either of those books to anywhere, you know where you are because it is either first person or third. Um, and then the final point is that I think they bring you to about the same distance from the reader. So first person past and then third person present. But it is always,
Hmm.
I think it is always tricky. I was worried about doing it for Night Tiger. You know, I just
Hmm.
felt like doing it. And then when I turned it into my agent, I was like, oh my goodness, she might not like this. This is the terror of writing fiction. So if any of you have, I don't know, written a thesis, and you feel like there's this big weight hanging over me for, a year. Well, writing a novel, as you might know, is like the thesis that goes on and on, except at the end, when you show it to your thesis advisor, they had no idea that you were writing a book about dolphins. You'd be like, ta-da, dolphins. So I was I was a little worried when I showed her Night Tiger, and I thought, well, part of it is in a completely different tense. So luckily she liked it, but it is
Mhm.
also, to be fair, I have other author friends who've also told me, like, sometimes they've done something different and their agent hasn't liked it. Um, and in which case, sometimes they switch gears or they switched agents. So all of this is very much dependent on your work, how you feel about it.
Mhm. Mhm. Well, that's a lovely I I don't know if it's a metaphor, an analogy, but oh, it's just like such a lovely way of describing the writing process as listening to music and having it come. I feel that too. I equate it like sometimes also because I paint, you know. I was
Mm,
interested to hear that you draw, that sometimes I can describe like my book as that the colors of this scene, you know, that I'm using very pale blues here, or like in this scene is like much warmer colors. So it's really interesting, like this the synchronicity of how you're thinking about your writing as you work. There's another thing that you do, which, and then this will be my last question, um, which is that I thought it's so interesting how you are not afraid of language, right? Because right now I'm writing a historical fiction. It's set in 19th century China. You know, there's this complication that, as you know, that in a Chinese household, every one person is called three different names depending on who's using the name to call him. Like, it's just this mess. And so my editor is going, we're going to have to figure out a way to clue people in on what you're talking about, and that this is actually the same person, even though they're so there's this huge tangle when you get into different cultures, and you have to do that cultural translation and not let it get in the way of the story. Um, and yet, you know, you do that so well, like in the Ghost Bride, just to anyone who like knows and is listening, there are all these different languages like mixing in there, right? You're writing in English, sometimes you use a Malay word, you italicize that, so and then there's like a little very neatly kind of folded in three words that kind of gives you a clue as to what what word was. That the names, and I think that this is so characteristic of Malaysia and Singapore, but they're two Chinese dialects at least that are playing in here. All the names seem to be in Mandarin, and all of a sudden the name of like something like oh, the I love the chairs and the ayahs and all all those little verbalizations that to my ear sound much more Cantonese. So I'm really impressed that you're just not afraid of these languages. When we get to the Foxwife, you've got Mandarin, Manchu, and Japanese going on, as well as English being the written language. Did it, you know, scare you at any point? Did you think, how am I going to explain all of this and not stop my story? And I see that to a large part for the cultural stuff, you use end notes, but also in the Foxwife, you're using little margin notes now and then. Whose idea was that? Like, and how did at any one point did you think, I have to explain this, or did it once again, did it just like come kind of naturally, I'm gonna do it this way?
it continues with that there was no plan, but but I would say, for example, the marginalia. Let me tackle that for the Foxwife. It is, as you might have seen the end notes, marginalia is really very much a historical part of Chinese literature, in which people would write notes in the margins, and they would be considered so interesting. The most interesting ones would be republished by the publisher, you know. So that was always interesting. And one of the books that I love is actually Jonathan Strange and Mr. Norrell. So if any of you have read that, they're like copious footnotes. And initially, what I wanted for the Foxwife was copious footnotes too. In fact, I had written a lot of them. And then my agent was like, "You are way, way over the word count." I was really far over the word count. And so a lot of them got lost. But one day I would love to write a book with all the extra side stories. That's the part of it. As for the languages, I try to keep the languages to be the ones that I know. So, for example, in Night Tiger, or at least that I felt comfortable, I could write those sentences. So in Night Tiger and in The Ghost Bride, like in my mind, I know who the characters are. And in The Ghost Bride, the cook is Hainanese because there's a lot of Hainanese, but a lot of people would be speaking Chinese, Cantonese. In Night Tiger, a lot of the staff are Cantonese. And so when I was also writing the dialogue for the cook, then I hear in Cantonese in my head, and then I just translate it. That's why it's kind of like broken English sometimes, but it's like he's literally saying blah, blah. Okay, then I'll just write that down. So that made it, I think that probably makes it more natural. The only thing that I had trouble with was one Hainanese phrase because I don't speak Hainanese. I can speak Mandarin as well. And then when I ended up doing the audiobook for it, I was like, why did I put in a Hainanese phrase? I went to ask this Singaporean friend of mine. I was like, there's a Hainanese phrase. I got to read it. And he said to me, why did you do this? I said, because historically the cook should be Hainanese, right? Sorry, this is kind of like going to the minutiae. And he's like, okay, this is how you pronounce it. But I knew what the Mandarin equivalent was. So I think, sorry, to cut a long story short, I think write what you feel comfortable. The reader will hopefully feel that you are okay with this and you can carry the story along. If a book had to be written in Norwegian, I would really struggle with it, But so I think that's a lot. I mean, some people do different things, like some people writing sci-fi and fantasy, in which case you can do whatever you like. But at least in terms of the languages, I try to stay with what at least I felt comfortable with. I don't know whether that confused a lot of people. It might have. So.
No, it's so interesting. And just because you mentioned the Hainanese cook, my one bone that I have to pick with you is that, Hainanese chicken rice is like one of my favorite things on the planet. And my brother, who turned pescatarian years ago, he gives himself a hall pass that when he's back in Singapore, he's allowed to eat Hainanese chicken rice. That's how much we love it. But you made this man in a very unappetizing moment smell like Hainanese chicken rice.
Oh. Well, it's delicious
I'll
at
never
the
smell
time.
it the same way again.
I'm sorry. It's delicious at the time, so but afterwards it's not always great. But but I do share your love. It is for those who have not had it, it is a wonderful dish.
It's beautiful. Okay, so thank you so much for doing this interview part. I'm going to turn over to everybody else now so they can ask their questions, and we still have a little time with you, I hope. And so I'm just going to wait for the camera and say thank you.